So thanks for the invitation. I appreciate the chance to join everybody today on a topic that really is one that I have a lot of passion about. Now, I'm going to use a couple of slides here to guide my remarks and kind of keep me on track. So bear with me as I do that. 1 second. Very good. So I suspect most of the folks who are joining us today are familiar with Bessemer Venture Partners. They're one of the iconic, actually, VCs in the Valley. They were founded in 1975. And in recent years, they put out an annual State of the Cloud report, in which they make a number of predictions about the future. And one of their predictions in 2020 was that, you can see here on the screen, we were entering an age of automation at scale. And I'm sure that means many different things to different people. But there's a lot of confusion about what that actually means. And there's confusion around what the right set of tools are that constitute say a reference tech stack for automation. There's confusion about the skills and organizational structures that are needed to achieve this kind of an objective. And then finally, there's confusion about how to think about the value that businesses derive from the use of automation technologies as well. And when you think about that, I mean, let's go back to the tools. There are normative tech stacks for things like DevOps and security operations. And perhaps your company can't fully afford the entire stack, but the roadmap is pretty well laid out. And as incremental budget comes along, people know what they want to go out and acquire. If you think about skills and organizational structures, I would suggest we use as a reference model there a PMO organization, a program management office or program project management office. Most IT groups have some kind of a PMO. The skills that you need in the PMO and the tools that they need are very well understood. But again, there's a lot of variation about what would constitute an effective automation center of excellence or program management office. And then finally, in the area of value realization, we'll talk a little bit about this. There are many different dimensions in which automation can be viewed from the business's point of view. And again, there's no one normative set of tools or what would you call them, frameworks that can be used to share that kind of information and provide that kind of insight to our business partners. So I really want to tackle all three of those dimensions of what constitutes automation at scale. And I'm going to start here by sharing a very high-level depiction of the current automation tool landscape. Now, a word of caution, I'm referencing some specific products here, but I'm only doing that for illustration. I'm not trying to endorse any particular vendors or any particular products in this rendition. And I would suggest or contend there's sort of 5 different core tool areas or core tool types that most people assemble when they think about trying to automate business processes. Now, it's important to differentiate business process automation from other forms of productivity tools, such as a ServiceNow or a Slack or an Asana or Monday or Trello or Smartsheet that are either trying to optimize the productivity of teams or the productivity of individuals. And those provide automation capabilities as well. But this particular depiction really is focused on business process automation. I'd first direct your attention to the 2 ovals here at the bottom of the diagram. And I would describe these as foundational capabilities. Everybody has a set of core business applications, whether they're using ERP systems like SAP and Oracle, or they've assembled some SaaS-based platforms like Salesforce and NetSuite and Workday. And what's interesting is that all of these core systems that are common currency today have actually edged their way towards providing automation capabilities. So for example, if you are using any of these products, I'm sure you're familiar, SAP and Oracle have something they call Workflow Builder. Salesforce has a Process Builder. NetSuite has a tool called SuiteFlow. And all of these are pretty similar drag and drop, point and click capabilities to try to design and orchestrate workflows primarily within those platforms. Now, in many cases, the platforms have API connections to other tools, and some degree of orchestration can be established through their design processes as well. But these are primarily focused at getting the maximum benefit out of the tools that you have in the core systems area. The other foundational capability is around integration platforms, of which SnapLogic is one. And these have been around for a long time as the SaaS tools proliferated, the business apps proliferated. It became obvious that APIs needed to be exercised to be able to synchronize and exchange data across different applications. And just as Craig pointed out in the previous talk, these tools were originally used to really move data around more in block format or to synchronize data across applications. But now, much more frequently, they are used in a more granular way to use trigger events, as they were described by Craig, to orchestrate or automate some very granular workflows that could be triggered by a visit to a website, the return of a defective product, an exogenous business event like an M&A event, or even a current customer visiting the website of a competitor. All of those kinds of activities could actually be detected and trigger events which lead to the exchange of information and effectively automate some kind of a response process within the enterprise. So I would describe these ovals at the bottom as foundational capabilities that most people have. And in fact, they can leverage them in many ways already. The ovals at the top are relatively new capabilities in a relative sense. I'm not going to belabor RPA tools. They're very well publicized and promoted. Everybody has heard of automation anywhere and UiPath. These tools started as basically screen scraper technologies in which a virtual robotic digital self was created that could emulate or reproduce the way in which a human worker interacted with a GUI screen. And they become increasingly more sophisticated over time. Some of the bots that can be constructed with these tools today employ AI and ML technology to actually make almost human-like decisions in ways that either reduce the risk of the outcome of a specific action or try to optimize the attainment of a specific metric. In the upper right, there has been also another proliferation of technologies around low-code and no-code development. OutSystems and Mendix are leaders in the low-code space, and more conventional vendors operating in this area are Pega, formerly known as Pegasystems, and Appian as well, and many, many others. And again, these tools can be used in ways in which a design studio is provided, in which somebody from IT and somebody from the business can sit down, design a workflow. IT can go off and use an iconized approach to assembling, composing an application, and maybe doing a little bit of coding around the edges, particularly for more complex processes. These tools are extremely valuable in accelerating time to market of bespoke business applications that are designed for a specific activity, a specific process, or maybe a specific work group. So think about a process like field workers that are going out to install solar panels or to service oil wells. And you might develop some kind of a low-code application that would basically skin maybe a half a dozen SaaS tools and provide a single user interface so that the people in the truck that are running out to put in the solar panels, kind of have a single interface to the data and the functions that they need to optimize their productivity on the job. And then finally, in the middle here, there's a subset of tools that can be used to analyze and re-engineer business processes. And so that acronym MMDM is defined in the upper right-hand corner of this diagram. So many, many conventional mapping tools. I'm sure most of the people joining us today have been locked up in conference rooms from time to time with business counterparts in which they've mapped out, some type of a business process, try to understand what the business is doing before making changes to IT systems. There are mining tools, and so a mining tool typically looks into application logs to look at the way events are triggered and correlated in the applications that business people are using. The discovery tools are more of that screen scraping technology that I talked about that focus on GUI interactions. And then there are generic modeling tools as well, process modeling tools. And to some degree, these tools, in many cases, have interfaces to the RPA technologies or the low-code technologies, et cetera. And in fact, this entire landscape that I'm showing here is increasingly kind of overlapping and compressing. I don't know if that's the best verb, but what you'd find is these workflow builders that I described in the core system area. Many of those have a no-code kind of an interface, and so they've embraced some of the technologies you see here in the upper right. Some of the RPA vendors have started to develop API management capabilities that would, to some degree, duplicate the capability of the integration platforms. And as I'm sure you'll hear during the SnapLogic conference today, there are many capabilities that are reflected in the ovals outside of the integration platforms that are being incorporated in SnapLogic's offerings as well. So it is interesting. There's a bit of a grand synthesis that's happening, but it's important to remember that people are coming at this process automation problem from some very different technology directions. And the mix of tools or the proper tech stack that's suitable for your needs, I think, is very much up in the air at the present time. And we'll talk a little bit more about tool selection in a moment. The second topic that I wanted to cover was value realization. And remember at the beginning, I talked about the confusion over the skills and organizational structures, that are needed to really achieve this strategic automation at scale benefit. And it's not surprising. It's sort of the standard lineup here that you would expect from any kind of a strategic initiative that revolves around people, process, and technology. And there's some key forms of new talent that are needed to really make the most effective use of these tools. So the first I would refer to as an automation engineer. And I want you to think about the automation engineer in two ways. On the one hand, he or she is basically a solution architect that would look at the tools that you have in your toolbox and look at all of the complexities around the APIs that will be needed, the data management, forms of data that will have to be incorporated into whatever the automation solution is going to be. There may be licensing issues, there may be regulatory concerns, there may be security issues, all the kinds of things that, frankly, let's face it, people outside of IT don't normally think about. So these individuals will become the solution architect to find the right tool and configure it in the appropriate way, interface it to through the APIs to the appropriate data sets and applications that are needed to support this automated process. But that's really one half of the job. On the other hand, they'll also serve as product managers. And so as any kind of an automated process gets developed, and particularly for more complex kinds of business activities, there will inevitably be some form of human interaction that will occur with the script or the playbook or the bot or whatever the automated tool actually is. And these automation engineers need to be able to think through the eyes of the human workers who will still be interacting with these various forms of automation and provide something that's easy to use, intuitive, and that provides the human worker the appropriate information at the right time to keep the process moving forward as efficiently as possible. So a combination of solution architect and product manager will be the roles for these engineers. The folks we referred to in the past in IT as business systems analysts will need to change stripes a bit and become more sophisticated business process analysts. They'll be the ones that will be manipulating those MMDM tools that I referred to in the prior diagram. And if you've had business architects in your organization before, they probably would more closely emulate the kinds of roles that a business architect had, individuals who knew more about business process necessarily than they did about some kind of a technology platform like a Salesforce or a NetSuite. So this is a different role than a BSA. This is not just putting a different colored baseball cap on a BSA and sending them in to become a business process analyst. There will be a need for ops technicians. Like everything else in IT, you don't just do this and then walk away and think that it doesn't need to be supported. And so, there will be the need to respond to user queries, react to changes in application functionality or API structures, possibly prepare evidence for auditing purposes from the automated procedures that are there, and keep an eye on performance and response times for these different automated tools as well. So there will be a longer-term support capability when you really start to think about automation at scale. And then finally, there'll be automation developers. And what I mean by that, those will be the folks that have specialized capabilities in the automation tools that you elect to implement within your organization. They could be knowledgeable about SnapLogic, they could be knowledgeable about UiPath, they could be knowledgeable about OutSystems or any specific tool. So that's quite a cross-section of expertise. It will probably have to be developed in part internally, but it will also require, I suspect, some external recruiting as well. And as so often in the case of new tools being brought into an organization, sometimes we tend to underappreciate the extent to which new skills are needed, and we tend to have kind of a just-in-time mentality when it comes to bringing those tools, those skills on board. And that's a grave mistake if, again, you're trying to make strategic use out of these new kinds of tools. The second key ingredient in value realization is to build your factory. And I like this term factory more than I like center of excellence, because I think it connotes more accountability for actually producing things that are going to generate some form of business return. Now, first thing you have to figure out is this specific entity, this factory, going to provide more of an advisory or oversight role? So is it like a methodology center that will publish standards and maintain repositories and perform some form of oversight? Or is it in addition going to have delivery responsibilities? Is this where some of the skills that you see in this slide, in the first half of the slide, are they going to be housed in this organization? Or are those skills going to be distributed across different functional teams? And I would contend that these skills are in such great demand at the present time that as a practical matter, you almost have to recruit into some kind of a centralized delivery factory, at least initially. As you all know, there's a bit of a debate that's going on at the present time about the role of citizen developers or citizen automators, out in the business, and the kinds of activities that they can and should be trying to automate. And I'm going to leave that to the side for the moment. But I think, again, if the goal of your automation initiatives is strategic in nature, you really need to hold some kind of a organizational entity accountable and not just presume that 1,000 flowers will bloom, and out of 1,000 flowers there'll be a few that will actually deliver the kind of strategic benefits that you're looking for. And that is a good lead in then to the second sub-bullet here around opportunity prioritization. I think as an IT organization, you need to determine whether this factory is going to have some form of a separate governance board that will ensure a continued focus on those strategic opportunities, or whether you're going to reuse some existing IT governance structure, maybe some governing committee that prioritizes IT projects in general, and have it also focus on your automation activities. Either way, there's not a right or a wrong kind of either way, but if you don't have some group that's really thinking about how this new set of tools is going to deliver significant bottom line benefits, you'll find there'll be many forms of benefits that can nevertheless be created, but people will end up scratching their head after some period of time and kind of wonder why they're not seeing kind of a more of a bottom line payoff from the investments that they've made. And then finally, you're going to assemble your automation toolbox. There are many ways, going into that landscape that I showed you in the previous slide, and getting out your wish list and your checkbook and determining what to purchase and what to implement. In many ways, that process will be similar to the ways in which we always buy IT tools, in which we investigate the functionality, the ease of use, ease of implementation, the business benefits or utility, and then the affordability, what can we actually buy. But you'll be challenged, as you are in many cases, when you think about bringing in new technologies, whether you want to assemble a suite of best-of-breed capabilities in some of the dimensions that I showed in the earlier slide, or whether you're going to rely on one or a very limited number of vendors that have more of a platform solution. And again, everybody that plays in this space today that's coming out of one of the ovals that you see there, has some kind of a heritage or background. Obviously, SnapLogic is in the integration platform space, and you need to be cognizant of that if you're going to decide that you're going to place your bets, so to speak, on one of the major vendors to provide the full set of capabilities that you're looking for. So these are the critical ingredients that you'd want to be proactively addressing if you were truly trying to achieve automation at scale. And that leads me to my last slide. This is around benefits reporting and actually measuring benefits. I think one of the standard ways that people think about automation is to measure the time that's been saved by the implementation of a script, a playbook, a bot, whatever you want to call, or whatever the actual product is of the tool that you're using. And it's a pretty simple calculation, right? You say, well, this is an activity that is performed by human workers this many times a week. We have reduced the amount of time they need to spend by X amount. We know the average pay of the people that do this kind of activity. So we can run this calculation and determine, what the monetary value is of the labor that's been saved. In theory and in practice, there's some benefit from doing this, but you have to be very, very careful of not reporting results that are, let's put it, they're not intuitive to your business peers. So I've seen many initiatives, and I've actually experienced this myself, where we use this methodology and reported savings that were almost not credible in terms of far surpassing what anybody actually thought was happening. They couldn't perceive, themselves the true amount of labor savings, both on a monetary basis as well as on a time basis. And there's good reasons for that. So one of the traps that you can fall into very easily is, if you give large numbers of people back very small slivers of time through some form of automation, neither their managers nor themselves may know how to harvest that savings in time, and apply it to other activities. It may be lost. The other thing that those calculations can run afoul of is that they're made on the basis of all other things being equal. And so let's take an example of some kind of warehousing operation. Perhaps you've used computer vision technology to automate a final check on materials that are being packed and shipped to some consumer retail business. So the customer has ordered 5 different things. They get into a pick basket. The pick basket gets scanned. Now by a computer vision tool, it gets referenced against the original order. The check is made, stuff is boxed and shipped off. And perhaps in the past there was a human worker that did that final check before the material was actually boxed. So you've had some time savings there. Well, what if, in addition to that savings, there were other changes happening in the warehouse? Perhaps the warehouse was expanded to accommodate more SKUs. Perhaps new types of material were put in the warehouse that were fragile and required special handling. Those are the kind of things that aren't taken into consideration when you do some of these straightforward calculations. And so I'm not suggesting that that they're inappropriate or that they should never be used, but you need to be very cautious in solely basing the reports of automation benefits in terms of monetized labor savings. One of the increasingly popular ways of doing this is in terms of service level agreements, or the SLA performance of your organizations. And automation many times is referenced as a way of improving customer experience, and you're going to see a lot of those kinds of benefits really expressed in terms of SLAs. An organization that's able to show that they've used automation to impose upon themselves increasingly stringent operational SLAs, I think is an organization that recognizes the value of these kind of tools, not just in producing bottom line benefits in this quarter or next quarter, but really on a more long-term strategic basis and developing long-term strategic relationships with their customers. So SLAs are very important. Transactional leverage can be an important dimension. This is a very straightforward calculation. If you are processing warranty claims or insurance claims, and there's a merger takes place and the number of transactions goes up by 50%, but the labor force that's required to address the new workload only goes up by 10% relative to the starting condition, then obviously you've achieved a higher degree of transactional leverage in terms of throughput of that particular group. And those kind of calculations or benefit measures can be performed typically efficiently at a departmental level. If you kind of scale up and think about the whole enterprise, the consistent use of these tools with some strategic prioritization over a period of time can lead to some very significant benefits in terms of OpEx leverage. And believe me, there's no CFO that doesn't want to go into a quarterly review with the analysts and be able to report that the company's revenues grew faster than their operating expenses. And the persistent strategic application of these tools across some of the more critical processes in the business will actually permit and allow that kind of thing to happen. I can think of a company today that actually has $1 billion savings target for its automation initiatives, and they expect to achieve that by 2025. They have a 5-year plan to reduce operating expenses by $1 billion. And then finally, headcount management. As I'm sure you're all aware, there are certain kinds of business conditions in which senior management becomes very concerned and very sensitive about adding headcount. So that can happen when business forecasts are I don't want to say dire, but there's concern about competitive pressures or consumer demand, and so the future looks pretty uncertain in terms of the growth of the business. There could have been a layoff or furlough of some type or another, and in those situations, executives are very concerned and reluctant to start adding headcount in the wake of a layoff. And so, although some of the vendors that operate in this space like to talk about virtual workers that they produced through the use of their technologies, I don't think that kind of terminology has caught on and become common currency to CEOs or CFOs. But when you run into these particular situations or scenarios where there's heightened sensitivity about recruiting activities, the ability to restrain headcount growth through the use of automation tools is a very tangible benefit, a very appreciated benefit to the senior management teams. So I really think you'd have to look at your own business. You look at the personalities actually of the senior executives in the company. In a B2C business where a lot of the growth and revenue is kind of word of mouth among the people that are using your products or services, the SLE performance could actually be a leading benefit in that kind of situation. In other situations, labor savings as monetized, could be the most single important metric to a COO or CFO or CEO. And then, again, any one of these, depending on the time and inclination and challenges that the business faces, these different measures could be appropriate or regarded in prioritization. So that's what I've wanted to cover today. I realize this has been kind of a quick conversation. I've actually published a white paper on the automation marketplace. If anybody's interested, you can find it published on the blog page of Workbench. Workbench is a New York-based VC firm, and the website's work-bench.com. So if you go to their blog page and you want to take a look at some of these comments in a little greater detail, I would direct your attention there. And with that, I'm going to stop the screen share. And
well, thank you, Mark. Hopefully, we do have a few minutes left, so I just had a couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Far away.
Okay, so you're a 7-time CIO. You've given us some good things to think about there with automation. With all the change that's happened in the industry, with all the technologies that's facing us now, a new CIO or IT organizations come in, or you look back at yourself, what advice would you give your younger self now? So you're coming up in the ranks, you're potentially going to be a CIO, you have all these technologies. You've given us some advice around measuring benefits and how to think about this area, but what advice would you give yourself to start looking at automation and integration? Like what are the key things you would go back and tell yourself?
So I think this applies to automation, but a lot of other kind of technology initiatives. Sometimes we really get trapped into a lot of prototyping and proof of concept. And I'll take automation as a good example, right? I mean, a lot of times, as you know, it starts in a financial function, and then you find use cases in maybe HR. Then you find use cases in distribution or in marketing. It in the best world circumstances, it kind of organically grows over time through word of mouth. And, you know, with 2020 hindsight, I mean, I'd look in the mirror myself and say, you know, there are situations where if you see some early preliminary results that are very promising, you really should challenge your fellow business executives about, you know, this thing has strategic benefit to the business.
Right.
And I can spend the next 3 years, you know, kind of wandering around being the evangelist, and you can look over our shoulder at our competitor, you know, they're going to have like a team of 100 people that are going to be doing this, and it'll take, you know, so I think you can get trapped into the almost endless stream of proof of concept and prototyping activities. And you may not always win the argument, but I think you owe it to the business to be able to, you know, make the argument that this thing has some real legs and some real significance to the business. So that would be one form of advice. Yeah.
No, that's good. I think, you know, obviously we talk to a lot of customers, and there is that, well, let's try it, let's do the proof of concept. But, you know, like you said, you can spend a lot of time just trying to figure that thing out instead of actually getting a lot of the benefits. You mentioned in one of your previous slides around automations is growing for things like customer experience. Customer experience then passes into lots of different functional groups. So like as a marketer, I'm very focused on the customer experience, at least for the pieces I own. And then as part of that, so we're getting more into what data like the marketing function needs and you know, HR or whatever. And we're seeing the rise of this term, I don't know if I'm sure you've heard it, citizen integrators, and the line of businesses are going to have more control. What are your thoughts around that? Like, are we there today? You know, is shadow IT becoming part of the business units? Like, you know, there's various different opinions. I'd love to get your take on, like, are we there yet? Is IT ready, or is it just, it needs some time?
I'm going to share some views, but it's a very fluid conversation, and I'm sure you'd find a diversity of perspectives here. So one perspective I have is, you know, we kind of sit in a bubble here in the Bay Area, which is a fairly technically sophisticated bubble, and you have people in those functional groups that might aspire to become citizen integrators or citizen developers or whatever. I know from personal experience, there are other larger, well-established companies where if you went over and said, I want to give you some training on like Snap Logic, they would look at you and say, isn't that your job? Like, that's IT work. Like, why are you, you know, you're not going to do any of my job. Aren't you offloading IT work onto me? Like, why are we having this conversation? So I think, you know, you might find that kind of reaction in lots of different quarters. And the other part of the bubble conversation is, and I know this through firsthand conversations with other CIOs, if you operate in a heavily regulated industry, you know, financial services, healthcare and others, there's a deep-seated aversion to losing control, to like having people. And I've actually heard of circumstances in a financial service organization out in New York where they went into a deconstruction campaign with the bots that had been made. I think they got up to about 800 bots. They felt they had lost control, the knowledge of what was actually happening. And, you know, a lot of their activities are heavily audited, and they have internal risk management concerns for their own financial viability. And so they actually, I think they deconstructed maybe like 400 or 500 bots. They went to they were just that concerned about it. So, So it's an open conversation. I mean, I think you'd find some organizations, it's probably fabulous. You know, it's going to produce multiple forms of benefits. I think the middle ground, this is a long answer, but I do believe, you know, with maturity, you start to put some guardrails around the kind of processes, the scale of the processes, you know, their criteria about what a citizen developer can go do versus IT.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, I'm going to give everyone, thank you so much, Mark.
My pleasure.
I really appreciate you joining. Hopefully we can continue these discussions in the future on other formats, but thank you for your time.